Good afternoon, class. You are welcome to today's lecture. Today we'll be looking at classes. So, what is a class? A class is based on the concept of objects. Classes are data structure representing real life objects, abstract entity or concept, and the real life object can be example car, animal, shape, color. So they are the real life object or abstract entity. So, and I told us earlier that classes are data structure representing real life object, and a class is like a blueprint for creating objects. So the characteristics of feature or property of this class are called attributes. So the characteristics of, maybe for instance we have our object to be a car. So the characteristics of that car or the feature or property of that class, they are called the attributes, and the action that can be performed on this class are called method. So the action that we perform on the maybe the class, so we see that from the example. So the action that can be performed on that class, they are called method. Let's take example of class vehicle. Vehicle as the object, as the real life object. So we have the class vehicle. So the attribute is the number, the attribute of that class vehicle is the number of wheel, steering wheel type, brand name, and the vehicle type. So that those are the attributes for that vehicle, the attribute. And we have the method too. I told us the method is the action that we perform on that class. So the method can be drive. The method for that class vehicle is the drive, service, engine, paint, body. So we have another example. Class as is to be polygon. Class polygon. So attribute for that class polygon is the area, perimeter, dimension, vertex, edges. So and we have the method as well for that class polygon, and the method is calculate area, calculate perimeter. So the method will always refer to the attribute for that class. So a class, to define a class further, we have a class is defined as a user-defined prototype for an object that define a set of attributes that characterize any object of the class. So class is defined as a user-defined prototype for an object. So it's a user-defined prototype for an object. I said earlier that it's like a blueprint for creating object. So the attributes are data members, that is class variable and instance variable. So we have two types of variable which we are going to look as we are going on in our lecture. We have two variables under class. We have class variable and instance variable. So under our the attributes, under the attributes of that are the attribute are data members. We have the class variable and instance variable and method as well. So the attributes contain data member and method, and under data member we have class variable and instance variable. So where I will be looking at as we go on in our lecture. So a class is a template for building objects. So it's a template for building objects, like a recipe. Maybe for instance, maybe you have you have a class of a, maybe you think of a class as a recipe, that is template, and an object as a cake made from that recipe. So I will just say an object. We cannot define. So for example, now let's see a builder. Someone wants to build a house. A builder wants to create a building of some types, of different types. So the builder uses a blueprint to ensure that the building will meet the required specification. So the builder has to use a blueprint to ensure that the building meet the required specification. So that's why I said a class is like a blueprint for creating object. So we are let's see an object. An object or instances. An object is a unique instances. It's a unique instance or occurrence of a class. So an object is a real word or digital thing created from a class. So it's a blueprint. So it's an object is a real word or instances. It's a unique instances of a class. So that is being created from a class. So we have the object contain all the method and attribute of the original class. So the data for each object differ. So the data for each object will always be different, and the storage location as well are unique, even if the data is the same. So and your program define only one user class but can create many different user from it. So instantiation is creating an instances of a class, and the result is an object. So it is very important for important that function of classes is that its methods can access and often modify its attribute. That each object has a view of self, or this as is differentiated from other objects. So we will see how we use this self, this the portion of self as a parameter, and all this, in this we use it in other in PHP. So where self we use it in Python. So and it's differentiated from other objects. Each object has a view of this and is differentiated from other objects. So let's classes in Python fully, how they use it in code, how they use the classes that we have been talking about in Python. So we'll be looking at that of the PHP as well too. So Python is a purely object-oriented programming. In Python, everything in Python is treated as an object. So it's treated as an object. That's why you call Python as OOP, object-oriented programming language. So from primitive all the way to classes. So a class is defined in Python by using the keyword class. So we'll be starting by using the keyword class. So in Python, so in PHP too, we start with the keyword class. So when we get there, we see that one as well. So the class name must be followed by this semicolon, that is it double colon in quotes, in double quotes, and then indented. So class name must conform to the rule for Python identifiers. So we have this example code, this little example code. We have the class example, class rectangle, with the double colon print. This is a class with double quote. So the attribute of a class are data or variable called property. So we take note of that. The attribute of a class, they are the data or variable called property or member variable. So I said earlier that we have two types of variable in a class. In a class we have two types of variable. We have the class variable and we have the instance variable. So for that of the class variable, they are a variable that is shared by all instances of a variable, and class variable are defined within a class but outside any of the class method. So class variable, they are always defined within a class, within the class of that variable. So but outside any of the class method. So we see the example of class variable as we continue, and class variable are not used as frequently as instant variable. So instant variable are used frequently and not class. So we have the example of class variable with the same class rectangle, double column, number of rectangles equal to 0, print the rectangle and number of rectangles. So the second type of variable here is instant variable. So they are the one we use that they use frequently. So a variable that is defined inside a method and belong only to the correct instances of a class. So instance variable, they are the variable that is defined inside a method and belong only to the current instances of a class. So the portion of a class are called method. So the portion of a class, they are called method, and all method of a class must accept as parameter set. So if we are writing a class function, a class function of a class that is called method, if you are writing, it must accept parameter set. So it must after you are writing your class. So we see from the example here. So it is standard practice to use getter and setter method to modify the properties of a class. So we'll be using getter and setter method to modify the properties of a class. So method use is self dot notation var underscore name, the double quote, to access the property of the current object. So we'll be making use of self dot notation var underscore name to access the property of the current object and to call other method on that object. So it is also used in define instances variable. So let's see example of what we have been saying. The example of what we have been saying about the function of a class called method, and to accept parameter self, and the method use self dot notation var underscore name. So with this same example code, and which is under instance variable, example under instances variable. So we have the class rectangle, number of rectangles equal to 0, when the rectangle are number of rectangles. So we in Python, have taught classes in Python in 201 introduced to Python programming language, that will start with def keyword as the function. So the function of a class in Python will start with def keyword, but in PHP it will start with dist. It will start with this thrs, this with the sorry, in PHP. So we are still going there. We are still going there, but it will always start with the function, not the function keyword. So that is for the PHP. But in Python, the def keyword. So def keyword, I told us earlier that we'll be making use of the setter and getter method to modify the properties of a class. So now we are using the set length. Those are the setter method, set underscore length. So the set, I told us that self refer to the current object. So self refer to the current object, and this will be making use of this dollar sign this in PHP. So which is refer to the current object that we are working on, that we are doing. So def keyword set underscore length inside the bracket self comma new length, and self notation length equal to the new underscore length. So and the continuation of the code, the programming. So we have def get, getter method, so to access the properties of a class. So def get underscore length self return self dot length. So we return the self dot length, and we def set underscore breadth. Those are the properties, the attributes of that class. So we have that of the set underscore breadth, self new breadth. So self dot notation breadth equal to the new breadth. So we have def get underscore breadth self return. So we return the self dot breadth as we return the self dot notation length. We return that of the self dot notation breadth, and we find the area, def area self. So the self dot notation area will be the return for the self dot length multiplied by the return of the self dot breadth, that of the length, self dot length multiplied by self dot breadth, or self dot breadth multiplied by self dot length. So we return the self dot notation area. So we do the same thing for that of the perimeter as well, as the attribute. So we do that of the perimeter, perimeter self. So we do that for that of the perimeter as we have done for that of the area, self dot area. So we do self dot perimeter, and we calculate how they do the perimeter in mathematics, just form it as a code using self dot notation, the breadth and the length. So it's supposed to be 2 multiplied by, with inside the bracket, self dot breadth plus self dot length. So we return the self dot perimeter. So we take note that it is a standard practice to define classes in a distinct file. So instantiating or creating an object from your class is done as shown below. So for us to instantiating or creating an object from the class, we will see it below from the example code. And if the class is to be used in another file, it has to be imported. So we need to import the file for us to use it in another file, so before it can be instantiated. So we ensure that the two files are saved in the same. So we have the example of importing the same rectangle. From rectangle, import rectangle. So we have the first rectangle equal to rectangle, second rectangle equal to the rectangle. So the member variable and method can be accessed using the dot notation. I said it earlier, we use dot notation to access the member variable and method. And it's secure and safer to use the getter and setter method when accessing member variable. So when we are accessing member variable, it is important for us to use getter and setter method. So I said it earlier. So the example of importing rectangle from rectangle. So first rectangle as we is rectangle equal to rectangle, second rectangle equal to rectangle. So we have the first rectangle with the dot notation, which is the member variable and the method. So first rectangle dot notation set underscore length, same be applicable to the breadth as well, and second rectangle dot notation length with that of the breadth. So we have the output print length of the first rectangle to be first rectangle dot notation get length, and print area of the first rectangle and length of the second rectangle and the area of the second rectangle. So the code above, this code creates two distinct objects, which we have the first rectangle and the second rectangle, and each has its own storage space that contains its own member variable. So each of these objects, it has its own storage space that contains its own member variable. That is, first rectangle dot notation length is different from second rectangle dot notation length. So we can see each of these objects has its own member variable. So we have constructor, and all objects in maybe in Python or PHP have a special building method. So which is automatically included by PHP in any object created, even if it's not visible. We call it a constructor. So constructor is called when an object is created to initialize the property of an object on instantiation. So that is give it default value. So the value can either be passed as a parameter or it can be explicitly specified. So we start a constructor. Constructor can be started by designated as underscore, starting with the underscore INIT and end with the underscore. So that is what a constructor. So when you see underscore INIT underscore, it will know that it's a constructor. So it's a special constructor method that run even when you create a new object. So when you create a new object, there is a special constructor method that run, and that constructor method is designated as INIT underscore. So we can see the example of how we use it in this code. The same example class rectangle number. So we have the DEF, the constructor, the special constructor I said, which is underscore INIT underscore self. So the self dot notation length equal to 0, self dot notation break equal to 0. So we can as well write the code, the program in another way. So whereas that on another way to be include with self, SEF, that's the difference. It will be include with self and new length and new breadth. So we have the class rectangle, number of rectangle, print the rectangle and number of. So we have DEF, the constructor underscore INIT underscore, inside the bracket we have self, and self refer to the current object. So and we have self new underscore length, new comma new underscore breadth. So we have self dot length equal to new length and self dot breadth equal to new breadth. So when we are instantiating an object using the constructor, so it's also done using the new keyword. So we have the rectangle, import rectangle, and the first rectangle equal to rectangle inside 25. So that is for that PHP. So we want to that is for Python. We want to look at classes in PHP. So PHP from the history historically is a procedural language. So PHP is known as to be, history wise, is in a historical wise, it is known as to be a procedural language. But now, however, it has now been extended with some OOP feature. So we have extended PHP with an OOP feature, object-oriented programming features. So, and a class is defined in PHP by using the keyword class, as the same way in Python that we use the keyword class. So the class definition must be enclosed in curly bracket. So in that of the PHP, it must start with the curly bracket and end with the curly bracket. So we'll see that as we continue with the lecture, with the example code, how we write the code and start, write the class or the class object, and how it will start with the curly bracket and end with the curly bracket. So we have the class name to be case insensitive and must conform to the rule for PHP identifier. So the class name std class is reserved. You cannot have a class name std class in PHP. So we have the example of PHP class rectangle, starting with the curly bracket, end with the curly bracket. So the attribute of a class are that of variable called property. I've said it earlier in fact. So we have the example. We have another example of PHP class rectangle. We have all the attribute for class rectangle. So PHP class for rectangle in this program. So for rectangle, and which is the PHP class for rectangle, which is a grouping for creating rectangle objects. So the class contains it contains the properties, that is variable, like the length, breadth, area and perimeters. So, and we have the method as well as we continue in the example example code. So the portion of a class are called method. I've said it in PHP, and it is a standard practice to use getter and setter method to modify the properties of a class. So the property are set by using the $sign this with the arrow pointing to the var underscore name. So in that of the Python itself, we use self, which refer to the current object. So but in PHP, we use $sign this with the arrow pointing to the variable name. So that is for the PHP. So you take note of the difference. That of the Python itself, we use self. So with the variable, with the data or the variable for the attribute. So for the property of a class. So but in PHP we use $sign this with the arrow pointing to the variable, property or variable of that class. So and we have the php, this let php know that you are referring to the variable inside the class. So when you use $this with the arrow pointing to the variable name, it means that you are referring to the variable inside the class. So within a method, the $this variable contain a reference to the object on which the method was called. So method use the $this variable to access the property of the current object and to call other method on that object. So we have the example of the full example code for PHP. So with the same class rectangle, the same class rectangle that have the property, that is the variable length, the variable length, length, breadth, area, perimeter. So it has the property, that is the variable, like length, breadth, area, and perimeter. So and it now come up with now portion, the portion area. So but in Python we use def keyword, but in PHP we use portion keyword as the method. So as a method for that class. So we have the portion area to, so we use we'll be using later we'll be using from the code, we'll be using set and get method, set and getter method, the set and get value to calculate the area and perimeter. So but here with the portion area $this with the arrow. Now I told us that the $this is the is refer to the current object, but in Python itself, so the $this pointing to the area. So we have $this with the arrow length multiplied by $this with the arrow breadth. So we return the $this area. So we have the close with the curly bracket. So we have the portion parameter. So we do the same thing for the portion parameter as we do for that portion area. So we have the portion parameter, we have the portion. So we now make use of the getter, setter, and getter method. So the getter and setter value, we set the length to get the value for set underscore length, $new length. So $this length equal to $new length. So we have the portion get underscore length, return the $this with the arrow length. So the same thing applicable to the portion set breadth. So and as well the portion get breadth. So that is how we calculate the method, the portion for to set and get value, and we calculate the area and the perimeter. So we have it's a good practice to create your classes in a different PHP file. Instantiating or creating an object from your class is done with the keyword new. So when we are creating an object from the class or instantiating an object from the class, is done using the keyword new. So we can see the example above that we just, the code that we just explained. So we use the keyword new. And if the class is to be used in another file, it has to be imported before it can be instantiated. So we need to import the class before we can use it in another file. So we have the PHP, the same rectangle class rectangle. We have the PHP first rectangle equal to the new rectangle. So and the second rectangle equal to the new rectangle. So we one can access and modify the attribute of the object by using the arrow that we use in this arrow on double quote, and it is secure and safer to use getter and setter method already defined in the class as we have done for the Python. So we do using the getter for the setter for the length and getter for the breadth using the same rectangle. So we have the first rectangle, second rectangle, new rectangle, and we have using the set length, set breadth. So and second rectangle with the arrow that modify or accept the attribute of the object. So with the arrow that points to length equal to 25, second rectangle with the arrow that points to the breadth. So we have the output as well, which is echo length of the first rectangle, echo area of the first rectangle, echo length of the second rectangle, and echo area of the second rectangle. So PHP create two objects, which is the first rectangle and second rectangle, and they are distinct from one another. That is, first rectangle with the arrow pointing to the installed separately from the second rectangle with the arrow pointing to the length. So we have an object that have a special built-in method. It is automatically included by PHP in any object created, and it is called constructor. And the constructor is used now. Explain that. So the same way the constructor, we have a special constructor, and we start with the underscore INIT, starting and ending with the underscore. So we have the example of what we are saying. So with the same class rectangle and with the properties, that is the variable for the class rectangle, so which is length, breadth, area, and perimeter. And the function, this is the constructor underscore constructor. So we have this on dollar sign, this with the arrow pointing to equal to 0, and the dollar sign equal to the arrow pointing to equal to 0. It can be written in this form. So with the property, the variables, and we have the function with the constructor. So and the variable inside the underscore rectangle underscore length, dollar sign rectangle underscore breadth. So and we find the function, the method. So for it, so we calculate the function perimeter, and we calculate the function the function length and breadth. So we have the an object instantiating an object using the console is also done using the new keyword. So which we have the first rectangle dollar sign, first rectangle equal to the new